going to talk about the development cost of conflict and some of the implications when it comes to food security. Everybody agrees in the literature that, of course, conflict is a development course, but then there is no real agreement, both when it comes to methodology, but also when it comes to the costing of conflict and its implication on development. So there are methodological challenges that are also reflected in the region, despite the fact that the region is one of the most affected, conflict-affected regions in the world. This is the outline. I'm going to go through all the stages in 15 minutes and at this time, so I hope you sympathize with me. There are two main categories of conflict. Probably most of you know, one is a civil conflict and the other one is interstate conflict. And the literature has always been revolved around these two categories. The literature started basically from the seminal work that Collier did in 1999 when he was focusing more on civil conflict. And basically the finding was that the civil conflict, 1 year of civil conflict has, in terms of GDP, is measured in around 2.2% of the GDP in the immediate impact of the conflict. Then, of course, the literature has been developing through Collier, Roderick, and others. The interstate conflict literature has been revolving more on the impact on trade, rather than the structural aspect that the civil conflict can entail. But all this doesn't go unchallenged. There is a conventional wisdom also say that basically the interstate doesn't have all this impact, and a lot of microeconomists say, okay, but conflict can be just a kind of transitional deviation from the state-to-state status of a country. And also there are more kind of redistributional aspect rather than GDP per se, because some of the literature focus on the spending allocation of conflict and what it entails in terms of military spending. So when it comes to the methodology that we have been used for this region, we didn't look much into the reduced form, it's called in economic terms, because of course a lot of studies have been basically using equations that put conflict in one of the explanatory variables for growth or GDP level. So, but this basically doesn't address the issue that conflict might be also underlying and influencing part of the other explanatory variables of growth. So it gives rise to a problem of multicollinearity and also metered variables. So we use a structural model based on a generalized method of moment. Basically, what we want to see is also to tackle the direct effect of conflict on these explanatory variables. And some of these explanatory variables in the literature, of course, we will find will be institutions, quality of policy, investment. When it comes to conflict, there is one methodological problem. There are basically two sets of data. One is number of casualties, and the other one is duration of conflict. We use the duration of conflict because it's more objectively measurable, whereas the number of casualties, of course, will create a lot of measurement problems. And also we try to take into account the dynamic effects rather than static effects to see what are the implications over time, and as I told you, the endogeneity issue. So the preliminary general findings that we found worldwide, and when we compare to the region that we study, which is the ESCWA region, when it comes to civil conflict, on the top part, on the left side, you see there is not much difference. When it comes to interstate conflict, on the right side, you see there is a big difference when it comes to intensity, measured in number of casualties, but with the caveat that I just told you. When you look at the first kind of very simple regressions, which are at the bottom, you see the first two graphs are related to civil conflict and the second two to interstate conflict. And then you can see that by the time, with the length of conflict duration, basically, you have a decrease in both GDP growth and GDP level. So basically, you can see a kind of a clear effect. You don't see the same effect when it comes to interstate conflict for a number of reasons that now we don't have time to explain. So using the structural model, basically, we tried to measure what is the impact on institutions, on conflict on institutions, and you can see that the one in bold, that the civil conflict in the ESCWA region has a negative impact on the level of institutions. So this is a scale of 1 to 10, basically it's 0.8, which is more or less equal to 1 standard deviation. And also you can see the effect of conflict on trade when it comes to civil conflict as well. And in particular, you can see the effect of conflict. All these asterisks, of course, means that
Vito, you have 2 more minutes, please.
That is significant. Of course, there is a big discouragement of investment. Then we took some Mdgs indicators, and we saw, we tried to measure what are the effect of conflict on some of the Mdgs indicators. Of course, again, the one in asterisks are statistically significant. And basically, the lesson that we can see is that 1 year of conflict in the region is enough to push back the average conflict country affected by conflict, 1 year of conflict, by 5 to 10 years, both in terms of GDP, but also in terms of socioeconomic indicators that are typically Mdgs indicators. For instance, you can see the first 2 rows on GDP, the measurement is quite high compared to other, the average, worldwide average. And also when it comes, quite strange enough, to income inequality, which is the last row, you can see the civil conflict in ESCWA increase dramatically inequality, and this needs to be explained. When it comes to the nexus between conflict and food security, you can see, basically, we took some, we did the analysis on cross-sections of all the countries available worldwide, and so where the conflict-affected countries in the region fit into the trend. And they fit quite well. You can see at the bottom of all these paragraphs. So it follows basically the trend line. So we have a number of challenges now that I don't have time to dwell on. One of these is, again, the public spending allocation. We have seen throughout the region over the last decade that still military spending, for instance, performs and has a crowding out effect when vis-à-vis public education expenditure and public health expenditure. One of the aspects to bear in mind in the post-conflict phase is the vulnerability issue. There was a question about the link between food security and poverty and so on. This is a region where we have 3 shocks that are combined in the region. Natural shock and climate change, of course, conflict-driven shocks, but also commodity price shock. All these 3 combined together increase the vulnerability of the population and, of course, of the poor. So one of the aspects when it comes to policy recommendations will be how to combine social protection with the risk coping strategies that we haven't talked so far enough. Then we did a bit of review of food aids, and of course what we've seen is that the food aid are very highly volatile, and there are new developments that are quite encouraging, and I mentioned the World Food Programme, Purchase for Progress. That is one of the aspects that also bear in mind the livelihood aspect of a conflict-affected region. You can see the volatility on the left-hand side of humanitarian aid for the region, and also the distribution of food aid on the right-hand side. Yellow is Egypt, which in the 90s was quite prominent, and then the green one is Sudan, which came more prominent later on. And this also we measure basically the deviation of oil together with also official development assistance coming from the Gulf countries into the region. And you can see how they can co-move quite well together, which is a further testimony of volatility. Then we move to the governance aspect of it, which is very, very crucial at this stage. And we saw that with a better governance system, doing through some simulations, there is a less likelihood of conflict relapse in the countries that have been affected by conflict. You can see the 2 trend lines. And also when you look with the governance indicators, we saw, you can see the 2 lines in the 6 graphs there. They are both the conflict-affected countries and countries in transition, currently in transition in the region. Both of them at the bottom, and the trends over the last 20 years almost are stagnant or have been deteriorated. So, of course, this has a kind of important aspect of it. Related to this, I will not dwell on it, is the land right and the land administration aspect, because the conflict and land in the region has been quite strong in the nexus. Particularly, you can see Sudan, but also Palestine and other countries in the region. Why I'm mentioning this? Because when we mentioned the governance aspect of it, also in my previous slides, land reform is one of the great entry points for a better governance reform in these conflict-affected countries. But of course, it will require a number of reforms. So when it comes to recommendations, of course, as I told you, conflict canceled back a number of years of progress in development terms. What we need is a circuit breaker, basically, because we see this endogeneity between conflict and development indicators. We need a better a way to reactivating public goods in conflict-affected countries because of all the challenges that I was referring to. Regional integrator, a better business environment, of course, will have a tremendous help. Family planning, obviously, in this part of the region, but particularly community-based development funds for infrastructure, which can combine immediate needs with the labor generation in creation of social capital and peace dividends. Of course, better coordination between different donors in the joint advisory missions, PRSP, SWAPs, and also reforming the consolidated emergency relief fund. This is one of the aspects that in the region needs to be considered if we really want to be active and quick in response in any emergency arising in the region. I will not dwell on research and development. One of the aspects of the implications of all this analysis is that donors sometimes react quite immediately in the short term. In the first year or 2 years because of the public pressure, of the public opinion and so on. But we have seen that basically the development impact of conflict spread throughout 5 to 10 years after the conflict. So donors' involvement in that needs to take this into account. It cannot be a huge influx of funds in the immediate without then with a dramatic drop soon after that. And of course, we need more analysis on the recommendation, on the understanding why conflict increases, for instance, inequality in the region, why in some cases is interstate rather than civil conflict having a negative impact on some social development indicators. Thank you very much.